maybe our third-party staff augmentation. All right, so let's talk about what we currently do for supply chain, right? And I want to talk about really here 3 main methods. Vendor questionnaires, we're going to talk about open source intelligence and scanning tools, and we're going to talk about certification frameworks. Jumping into that, vendor questionnaires. You've probably had to deal with these. If you're in GRC or leadership, you definitely had to deal with these. There's a lot of common ones out there like CIIQ or SIG-Lite. I've developed a bunch of internal ones for companies, so there might be bespoke ones too. These are really time consuming. Yeah, exactly, right? I spent hundreds of hours creating these. I spent hundreds of hours answering them, and I spent hundreds of hours pretending to evaluate them, right? So what are some issues with this? This is, I think, the CIIQ question. I think that's the one I pulled. Our processes, this is what you might have to answer as a vendor, right? Our processes, procedures, and technical measures defined, and I'm asleep right now, right? I still don't even know what this says. The really important parts are periodic, independent, third-party. Oh, pen testing. This is the pen testing question, right? This is the only pen testing question. But what are some problems with this? So first of all, the supplier could just lie. Yes. Because if we say no, we don't get the contract. If we say yes, we get the contract, they don't know. So we're just going to say yes, right? Also, they might do a pen test, but maybe it's just somebody doing a Nessa scan. Or maybe they don't test. What does periodic mean? What does periodic mean to you? More than once, right? But it should be yearly, maybe every 5 years. Guess what? That's periodic, right? And maybe it's not very limited in breadth. Maybe they only test a couple of systems, and those systems, don't touch those. Don't test those. You might take them down, right? Or maybe they don't test correctly. Like maybe they don't do authenticated web application attacks. Or maybe they don't do internal attacks too, right? We also now have AI answering questions to then feed to AI to evaluate the answers to those questions. So now we just basically have computers lying to other computers. That's great, right? So I think these are somewhat worthless. That's fine. They can, I have seen companies implement some of the questions because they're like, oh, we don't want to lie about it. But this isn't really giving us that, assurance that we really want. Open source scanners are really cool, right? So like if you are working with a company and their DMARC record doesn't exist or says P equals none, they can be spoofed right to you. And so now that's a supply chain attack where somebody can email you and say, hey, sending your bank account, is our bank account changed, send money here instead, right? And that a lot of times will be just accepted directly. I gave a talk on DMARC last year at BSides. External websites, you can evaluate those right now, right? What certificates do they have? Does Shodan have known vulnerabilities, right? And so these are really cool. You've probably heard of Security Scorecard or maybe PitSite. But I think these are actually pretty good, but there's also a lot of noise. So they might come up with all these things that say this is a bad company because, there's a certificate that's maybe self-signed, maybe by the organization's trusted CA. So maybe it's not really self-signed, but you're still going to get a hit on that, right? What does this not evaluate? Well, it only evaluates the systems it can find. So if, let's say, an IP address, a lot of old companies have like hundreds, sometimes thousands of IP addresses. Maybe only some of them had a certificate that allowed the scanner to detect that, right? But maybe there's other ones on there that aren't attributed to that company and are very vulnerable. It's not going to detect authentication. It's not going to detect susceptibility to social engineering. It's not going to check the email gateway for phishing. It's not going to do attacks on the web application because that would be hacking and they go to jail for that. It also doesn't know that supplier's supply chain. So these are actually pretty good. They provide some limited value, but they're also not going to be a silver bullet. And then finally, we come to what we've all had to deal with now for the last 5 years or so is SOC 2 and ISO. Finally, we have an audit. We can have somebody audit our supply chain, each of those companies, and tell us if they're good or bad, right? This isn't legally required by anything, but we've seen after SolarWinds a greater, focus on this. And like SOC 2 is just pumping up. Like it's so many people are doing it. I think it's a Ponzi scheme. Right? Because how do you get SOC 2? Well, you need to make sure part of that is making sure your vendors are secure. Well, how do you do that? Well, let's just ask them for a SOC 2. So then they have to go get a SOC 2. So how do they get a SOC 2? They have to make sure their vendors are secure. So then they have to go make them get a big Ponzi, right? So let's talk about this. What do these require? Does SOC 2 and ISO, do they require MFA? No. Then to the auditor, do they require pen testing? Yes. No for both of those. So neither SOC 2 or ISO require pen testing or MFA. And you're like, no, that's Mike, you're wrong, right? Let's look at the SOC 2 pen testing requirement. I'm not going to read all that. It's much of Joe. The most important part is this is the requirement, Common Control 4.1. This is the additional point of focus. This isn't even the main point of focus. The additional point of focus considers different types of ongoing evaluations. And it says down here, depending on the entity's objectives. Depending on the entity's objectives, such risk and control evaluations may include pen testing as one of many things. That's the pen testing requirement for SOC 2. These do not require those. If you know what you're doing, I built out a lot of SOC 2. I make everyone do pen testing. But at the same time, as long as you don't put in your policies, it's not required. Your auditor will give you guff on that, and you can push back and say, it's not required. Show me in the standard where it's required, and you don't have to do. So now we're like, wait a minute. So what could go wrong with these frameworks? Maybe the controls we actually care about are not actually part of the framework. That's a problem, right? Also, the scope is determined by the company being audited. Do you know how many times I'd had to argue about scope with an auditor? And it's like a lot of times the auditor doesn't even realize what's not included. Maybe AWS is where you have all your stuff. And so we do a SOC 2 on AWS. Great. What if all of our other stuff is in Snowflake? What if we're sending all of our data to Tableau or Snowflake or somewhere else? Half the time those get missed in an audit. So this is not really going to be as comprehensive as we want to pretend it to be. If you're doing something like FedRAMP, the FedRAMP PMO is going to really be an anal about like your scope, but that's not going to happen on SOC 2, right? So also for SOC 2 specifically, companies define how often, well, you do it every year, right? But companies are going to define the length of the evidence window. A lot of companies do a 90-day evidence window. What about the other, or 3 months? What about the other 9 months of the year? Did they follow the rules? Probably not. That's why they're doing 90 days, right? Also, evidence is sampled. The auditor's not going to look at all 10,000 of your employees. They're going to say, give me these 300 or give me these 20, and we'll look at the evidence for those. And so you might get lucky. Also, the evidence is provided by the company being audited, right? Now, like, for example, I keep using FedRAMP because it's a little more strict, but like FedRAMP will do a supervised vulnerability scan. They'll make you go and do that, and they'll evaluate that your network detection scan also matches your inventory and matches what it was in the scan, right? Well, I've never seen SOC 2 or ICE do that. They say, give us your vuln scans. And you're like, here you go, right? And they never ask about it beyond that, right? Sometimes better auditors will give you a little bit of heartache about that. But I've successfully come in to help audits at the end of it and been like, ooh, you didn't scan half of your systems? And you fight the auditor. Well, this is our business objectives. This is how we do vulnerability management. And then they pass. No notices on the, no exceptions, right? So, and sorry, who's here an auditor? Anybody an auditor in this room? Okay, one, I apologize. Auditors are usually not are technical. Some of them are phenomenal, okay? But they're usually not technical. And so explaining to them how certificate management works, they're not going to go deep into that. Explaining to them what vulnerability management scopes are, a lot of times they're not going to realize there's static code testing, there's dynamic code testing, there's pen testing, there's your cloud security posture management. I can go on and on and on and on and on. And a lot of times it's like, oh, you did a web scan. There's your vuln management, right? So they're not technical enough, and a lot of times they're going to be nice to you if you know how to deal with it. So I do think these are helpful. A lot of companies I've worked with have implemented a lot of good things because of that. But I also think that they're too focused on policy and management and not enough on the technical things that actually matter for supply chain. So let's wrap this up. I don't want to spend too much time bashing our current industry, but these three things, would they have stopped breaches in SalesLoft, Dropbox Sign, Circle CI, Okta support, et cetera? Would any of those, by the way, all of those companies, guess what they had? SOC 2, right? Would they have stopped the Plex server from the in LastPass? They didn't. Guess what LastPass problem? I'm assuming it had SOC 2, right? How about Microsoft Enter ID being hit by Midnight Blizzard, right? Well, guess what? They are FedRAMP. That may not have been their FedRAMP environment, but how about password attacks on the customer side of Snowflake? Did SOC 2 stop that? No. How about exfiltration of, please don't sue me, Oracle. I probably shouldn't have named name. 0 days in remote access equipment, 0 days in MSP tools. Those all had SOC 2 and all those things, right? They filled out all the questionnaires, right? How about malicious updates in SolarWinds? I'm sure Tim Brown filled out a SOC 2, all of the questionnaires. And, they weren't necessarily, we can argue about that. I don't think they were negligent, but hijack browser extensions. Guess what? Some little pet project that someone created a browser extension, they're not going to fill out a vendor questionnaire because you don't even consider them part of your supply chain. They're not filling out a SOC 2, right? How about nation state actors against executils? Again, that's an open source software that's in all of our Linux kernels. Every SSH relies upon that. And they're not doing SOC 2. They're not filling out vendor questionnaires. So I can go on and on and on. The NPM worm. How about insider threats from outsourced staff? How about social engineering of help desk? Right? None of these are protected by our current way we do supply chain security. I forgot to mention the Supermicro. Anyone remember the Supermicro story back in the day? So don't forget, you also have hardware to think about in your supply chain. All the laptops and the phones that you're using, guess what? That's part of your company's supply chain too. You might have hardware issues. It looks like that was a fake, like that was actually not really a hardware supply chain compromise. But you have to think about that as well too. Guess what? They're not filling out SOC 2. You're not making them do better questions. All right, so I'll stop complaining about that. Let's talk about what we can do, right? So there's a few things that we can do. The first thing is we can just not outsource that function and just do it in-house, right? Everyone should be laughing right now because no company, right, is going to do that, right? All the executives, leadership, sorry to make fun of leadership for a second, but leadership are salespeople usually. And they are easily sold to by other salespeople about why, if they do this and outsource this, it's going to save a lot of money and be more secure. I do actually think that outsourcing technology can be more secure because somebody's going to be able to handle and secure a whole stack better than you can. One example of that, right? We can also just buy the supplier and enforce our own controls. Again, you should all be laughing about that because no one, right? No one has the money to just go, oh, Office 365, how do we secure that? Let's just buy Microsoft. That's not going to happen, right? Sometimes this we might be able to do a little bit. We can use our purchasing power to enforce our own audits. Like we're going to send in our person. We want to see your logs. Give us your Office 365 log. Like if you're big enough, maybe you can require that, right? So that's a possibility, but this is still really not attainable for most companies and in most scenarios. So what do? I think the one thing we can do is implement zero trust on our use of suppliers, right? We talk about zero trust. No one really implements it. We talk about zero trust everywhere, but we should implement that on our suppliers the same way. We should basically focus on what we can control. So let's talk about how we can do that. So the first thing I say, this is so dumb, but nobody does this, right? Especially the bigger the company, the worse this is. Limit your number of suppliers. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into an organization and said, give me your list of what you're using. They don't give me the right list. We figured out, we look at your Office 365 enterprise. Who has Office 365 here in your company? Everyone's hand should go up because that's almost every company, right? Go into Enter ID's admin portal and click on enterprise applications. You will find, right? Because that's basically all of your interconnections for people to allow other programs to read their email for them, right? And so if you look at that list and you start going through there, you realize that most of those, no one's using anymore, right? I have saved tens of thousands of dollars in an hour worth of work for companies just by going in and saying, what is that? Oh, we don't use that anymore. Why are you paying for it? Let's get rid of it. So that helps your supply chain automatically reduce that. When you are onboarding new ones, you should try to think a little bit about, I forgot what I was saying here. Oh, so when you have new suppliers coming in, you really want to try to restrict that, right? So put technical controls around that, right? So we talked about browser extensions, IDE extensions for your developers, right? All of those other things, try to put controls on them. So you can do that sometimes through MDM app solutions like an Intune or Jamf or things like that. Those of you who rose your hand about Microsoft 365, if you're licensed for P1 or Business Premium or E3 or higher, you can onboard your systems into Intune, and they have Enterprise Chrome and Enterprise Edge policies as part of that offering. So you can do that and allow list extensions. If you have that, go into Office 365 and allow and turn on and require admin consent. Disable user consent to allow anybody to say, yes, please read my email in perpetuity, right? Turn that off. I would say there's like 5 permissions that you can still keep on that are a good idea to allow them to still do social sign-in. That's actually a good thing. So if you have questions about that, talk to me after I get to that. But also you can set application protection policies. Like inside of Office 365, you can say new apps, for example, have to have a certificate that's only 90 days long. And so then after 90 days, that loses that connection. Also offboard suppliers properly too. So when you're done, I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a network and seen appliances for systems that haven't existed in 5 years, and they're still running. And no one wants to turn them off because they're worried they're going to break something, but this is a connection to the supplier still. I just was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about how one of their old MSPs from like 3 years ago that they had a bad break with still has admin access to their M365 tenant. Turn that stuff off. Also, this is kind of cool. When you're done with a company, your NDA probably gives you the ability to tell them to delete your data, right? All those Salesforce breaches are a lot of times old customers had all their data leaked again because they didn't say delete our data. Now, are they going to fully delete it? Who knows? But you at least can legally talk to that. Another thing you should do is evaluate supplier reputation. So in this case here, right? What's the old saying? Nobody ever got fired from buying IBM, right? They're probably not the best product. But if you buy them and something goes wrong, it's not your fault, right? So think about it this way. If it's a popular vendor and they get breached like Microsoft, it's not your fault if Microsoft gets breached. If I offer email hosting solution and you start using it and I get breached and no one knows who I am, it's your fault for using me. So there's sort of a herd mentality here. I hate this, but this is true from like a liability perspective. Also think about recent breaches and vulnerabilities that have happened. Do not worry about the number. Everybody's vulnerable. Everybody will get breached. But think about how they respond. Think about the difference with how Cloudflare or AWS responds to vulnerabilities and breaches. They, like for a vulnerability with AWS, they will literally say, we look through all of the logs from the beginning of the service, and we can definitively say that we have never had this attack happen. They have that level of logging. Most companies say, we don't have any evidence of breach because we don't have any evidence, period, right? So think about the difference in how they respond, right? But this is not a silver bullet, right? Because you're still going to use a lot of vendors that have those problems. We talk about vibe coding. This is my way of saying vibe vendor selection, right? So there's a value here. This is more important now. Evaluate what controls you can implement with a vendor. So what is your customer capabilities? If you think about the Snowflake scenario, if you think about like, a lot of scenarios like that where it was the customer side that got breached, hey, how can we implement capabilities so that we don't have a problem with just our tenant, right? Does this vendor offer SSO? Does this vendor allow us to export logs, right? And so when you're doing your vendor evaluation, I think this is way more important than whether or not they have a SOC 2. Because if you can't control your side of the vendor experience, then you're not really able to secure your side of that access, which means that you're susceptible to passwords, credential stuffing on your accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I also think you should watch out for the license level. A lot of times, they have SSO. Oh, it's premium. I tried to turn on SSO for Cloudflare for that FedRAMP offering, and they said I had to 10x my spend with them. 10x. That's a lot. And then make sure you actually implement those controls. Ask them for a custom configuration guide or something like that. I'm running a little bit out of time. Again, these are online. I also think you should limit the capabilities, API keys, makes a lot of sense. Network isolation, right? This is important, blocking egress traffic. Most of these things that you install on-prem or even on your endpoints need to talk back to the main vendor's thing to get updates and send telemetry, but they don't need to talk to the rest of the internet. So you can do an allow list on DNS, right? And stop them from talking to CNC. Also update cadences, like this is the CrowdStrike thing. So if it's externally facing, patch it right away because it's going to get hit if it's no vulnerability. There's patch Tuesday and there's an exploit Wednesday, right? But slow that down a little bit. Maybe wait a day or two if it's not critically on the internet, right? Make sure, let the rest of the world know, hey, that actually is compromised, and then you can stop it from going out to production, right? And then for software development lifecycle, again, segmentation, segment your prod environment, egress filtering, EDR. These are all pretty good too. So you can use make sure you have branch control and version control system. That might have stopped the NPM norm that recently went out for a lot of those packages. Package repository mirror software composition analysis. So you can evaluate packages your developers are pulling in to avoid typo squatting and things like that. And then deployment controls. So CI/CD pipelines are very good because then your employee's not in prod. I also think it's really important to pull code in from a trusted environment. If AWS is where all your data is and you're using GitHub, don't use GitHub Actions to push to AWS because now GitHub and AWS have access to your production data. Instead, use AWS Code Pipeline and pull in the GitHub code. So this way, you're not actually getting GitHub with access into your production bar. And wait 24 hours before you push. Make sure they go to stage, make sure they sit in stage for 24, 48 hours, and then go to production, right? All right, I'm almost out of time. I have 1 minute left. So let's just kind of talk about how you could do it. First thing I'd say is first figure out what you have. So go to your Google or 365 app connections, look at your credit card bill, look at your firewall DNS logs. What do I actually have? You have 10 times what you think you have. Second thing, pick an easy control. Pick one control that you can implement on your side, SSO, log exports, whatever it is, and try to implement that everywhere you can. But use a risk-based approach for that. What's the most important? Email, your code repositories, finance, HR. What's the most important to your business? And implement those there first. This is extremely important. Make a business case for why the control you implemented helped the business. They will support you with other controls. We did SSO. That made everyone's lives easier. We spent X number of hours less on the IT side, resetting passwords, things like that. And then make sure this is built into your maintenance. Make sure, is SSO supported by the vendor? Put that into your procurement process, right? Make that be a question to the vendor on the procurement side. That's way more important than SOC 2, right? Add it to your yearly vendor risk assessments and then iterate on this approach, right? So I'm out of time here. So TLDR, ditch the questionnaires, secure what you can control. And I think that's really the story. So hopefully that was useful for everyone. Hope we had a good time with that. Like I said, this is available on,